colors. It's made in Mexico. I thought it was so neat, so I thought this would be a good candidate for a makeover. I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to do with the frame, so I went to Lowe's and I picked up a sheet of pegboard. The smallest they sold it in was 2 foot by 4 foot, but they will cut it down to size for you. So we went outside, pressed the button, and someone will come out and cut it down to the dimensions or the size that you need, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. The next step was to prep the frame for painting, so I masked it off and then got to work sanding. I sanded off this gold overlay as well as the wood all around the frame. And then using a solution of vinegar and water, I wiped the frame clean so it would be ready for painting. I'm using Rust-oleum Painter's Touch in Gloss White. This is a paint and primer in one. I thought that I wanted to have my frame be all white, and I thought I was going to leave it that way, but I did end up painting it a color. But that's okay, this works as a great primer too. So I gave it 2 light coats of this, letting them dry in between, and then I'm going to go ahead and get to work pulling off the tape. And it was at this point that I realized I like the white, but I'd rather go with my new favorite paint, which is Behr Tide Pools. So I got out my Purdy paintbrush and went to work painting into the details. This frame has a lot of details on it, so I really had to work that paint in and try to fill all those little crevices. I did the first coat and then I put my paintbrush into a ziploc bag. I do this so the paintbrush doesn't dry out in between coats. And then I put on a second coat and I let that dry. I wanted to add some golden highlights to the detail, so I used Rust-oleum Pure Gold from their Universal line. This is a metallic paint and primer in one. So I just sprayed that onto a soft rag, and I lightly grazed just the high points of the detail with the rag. So you can see the paint just slightly brushes on, and I'm being careful not to get it in too deep into the details, unless that's where you want it. You can really just kind of play around with this technique and come up with your own sort of ways of doing it. I'm also brushing along this sort of trim around the border. I'm going to highlight these corners a little more and along the outer edge of the frame also, just along this detail. Basically just where a frame would naturally have wear, that's what I want to highlight. So you can add a little more paint as you go because it will dry out on your rag. So I just kind of ball it up like that, and it works as a perfect little tool to brush along those edges. And after adding the gold highlights to the frame, I decided I wanted to paint the inner trim or border with the same pure gold Rust-oleum paint. So I'm just doing 1 light coat, I'm going to let that dry, and then do a second coat. When the paint was dry, it was time to remove the plastic, and by the way, I just used a plastic garbage bag that I had cut into pieces to cover up the frame. So I'm just going to remove that and then the tape, and it's going to reveal the black velvet underneath, so we still need to get to work on that. I'm going to be using this leftover fabric that I had from a previous project. I cut it out in strips that fit the size of the frame. So you can see here, I'm just placing it down, making sure that they fit, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut the corners. So I'm basically creating kind of mitered corners so they will meet and overlap slightly like this. After I finish cutting all the fabric, I seal the edges with my lighter to help prevent fraying. I'm using 3M Spray Adhesive, so we're outside now. Make sure you do this outside. So I'm just using a manila folder just to help sturdy or help stabilize the fabric. And I'm spraying the back of the strips of fabric and pressing them down into place, starting at the corners and then smoothing out any bumps along the way, making sure the fabric lays down nice and smooth against that black velvet. And I continue on spraying the back of each strip of fabric and pressing it down into place over the black velvet. Remember that pegboard that we got at Lowe's earlier? I'm going to be tufting it. So I set my frame over it and decide where I want my tufting. So I'm just marking out the corners, and I'm going to use this High Loft Quilters polyester batting. I'm going to cut out a few pieces of it, just squares that are just large enough to fit that space that we marked out onto the pegboard. So I cut one out and I just use that as my pattern to cut the other pieces. I'm going to cut a total of 3 pieces and I'm going to layer them on top of each other. Now back outside, I'm using my 3M Spray Adhesive and I'm going to spray one of the pieces of polyester batting. And I'm going to place that in the square that we marked out on the pegboard. And just press that down, make sure it sticks really well, and I'm going to spray each layer and press the next down onto it. So I've got 3 layers of polyester batting. Now it's time to figure out where you want the tufting. So I find my center line of holes and I work out from there in a diamond pattern where I want each of the tufts. I picked up these buttons at my fabric store. These are buttons to cover. It's a kit. I got them in size 36. I've used this before. It's pretty easy to use. All you do is cut out the pattern of the size you need, place that pattern over your fabric, and then just cut out a piece of fabric for each of the buttons you're going to be covering. In the buttons to cover kit, you'll have this rubberized piece, and so all you want to do is place your fabric over it pretty side down, grab one of the button tops, and you're going to press that down into that piece of rubber. And so sometimes you will need to use a little bit of extra pressure. Sometimes it's a little more difficult than others to get it down in there. And then you're just going to fold that fabric, the edges of the fabric, down inside the button. And then grab the back of the button and place that over it. And this little blue piece, that is your pusher. And so you're just going to press that back of the button inside there. Sometimes I use a pair of pliers just because it's easier on your hands. So I'll just lightly apply a little bit of pressure around the edges with my pliers. And it pops it right in there. And then all you have to do is pop the button right out. And then you have a perfectly covered button in the fabric of your choice. I'm going to use one of my upholstery needles to help open up the batting in each of the places I'm going to be tufting. So I'm going to poke the needle through the tufting layers. I'm going to take a pair of scissors and snip around it just to help open up those holes a little more. I'm going to be using this S-Lon bead cord. This is extra strength bead cord, and I'm just going to snip off a little piece of that, and I'm going to thread my button on. So I'm just going to slip that through, and the button is going to sit in the center of that cord, and then I'm going to take both ends and put those through the eye of my needle. So it's going to look like that. I'm going to lay the fabric down over the top of my batting and pegboard, making sure that it's centered, and I'm going to be starting my tufts in the center and working my way outwards. So I'm just threading my upholstery needle right through that center hole and pulling it tight. I'm going to be using this painter's tape instead of staples. You can use staples if you want. I didn't have any shorter ones. We have a heavy-duty gun and heavy-duty long staples, so that wasn't going to work for this project. So you'll definitely need short staples if you're using a thin piece of pegboard like this or a thin piece of wood. But I'm just going to be using the tape, and it's going to work just fine because these aren't deep tufts, they're very shallow tufts. So it's not going to need to be as heavy duty as, say, if you're making a headboard. So for each tuft, I cut a new piece of cord, and sometimes I will thread through the back first and just poke a little hole with my needle, and then I'll go through the front. Sometimes it'll make it easier to find the hole that you need through the back. And then I just pull it tight, and then just remove the needle, and I lay the board down, and I have my two pieces of tape ready. So I pull the cord tight, I press one layer of tape over it, smoothing it down, and then gently pull the cord in the opposite direction, placing the second piece of tape down, smoothing it over, and this will help lock the cord into place. And then just grab your scissors and cut off the excess piece of cord. I had a little bit of excess fabric, so I'm just going to trim that off. And then I'm going to cut the corners out, so that way when I fold over the corners, they're going to be a lot smoother and flatter. I'm using my 3M spray adhesive to spray all around the edges of the back of the pegboard. This is where the fabric is going to be wrapped around. So I'm just going to pull the fabric taut and smooth it into place. I want to turn this into a jewelry board, so I left some empty spaces where I didn't do any tufting. So right now I'm just marking out where I'm going to be putting some knobs so I can hang my jewelry off of them. Here's the first knob that I placed in the center. Now what I'm going to be doing is poking through with my upholstery needle into each hole and kind of working it to open up and stretch that fabric out a little bit. And since the screws have to go through batting, I found using a little pair of scissors will also help open up that batting and the fabric to help get those screws through without any problem. So I'm just placing each of the knobs one by one until I have a total of 5 going across the top, just like this. I'm covering the back of the pegboard with a piece of scrapbook paper. I just added a little spray adhesive to one side, and I'm just smoothing it into place. The top I'm going to leave separate. I'm just going to create a little flap so I can still have access to the screws and the knobs in case I need to change anything out. I'm going to finish off the frame with a bit of trim, so I'm using E6000 on the end of this rope trim. It tends to fray really easily, so this is going to help lock those ends into place. So I'm going to take this piece of scrap plastic and just kind of smooth it over the ends, make sure that E6000 gets down in there. I'm also going to twist the rope gently through the plastic, and that's going to help keep its shape on the end. I'm using my hot glue gun. This is a high temperature hot glue gun, and I'm just doing a few inches at a time, and I'm going to place the rope down So we're just going to do a few inches so that way it stays hot enough. Do be careful, do not burn yourself because these do get very hot and the glue can burn you. So I'm just doing a few inches at a time of the glue and then placing the rope down right after it. That way it locks it into place. Doing this also helps hide any unevenness of the fabric that I cut earlier. So even though you try to cut it as straight as possible, sometimes there's a little bit of edging that isn't quite perfect. So this will help to hide any of that. So once I get to the very end, I'm just adding a little more of that E6000, and again using a little piece of plastic just to smooth that edge and lightly twisting it. And then press it down into place so it meets up where you originally started at the other end. You want them to blend together as seamlessly as possible. And here Michael's nailing my tufted pegboard into the frame. So just to recap, here's what the frame looked like originally. It was very dark and had worn out black velvet, and here's what it looks like now. I'm so happy with how the frame turned out. I think it's so bright and pretty and uplifting, and I think Behr Tide Pools is just such a fresh, minty aquamarine color. I just love it. It's my favorite paint shade right now. And along with the gold highlights and the detailing, the ornate detail, I just think it turned out really neat. It just gives it that special pop and makes it even that much more unique of a piece. And of course, I'm a sucker for tufting. I just think it's so fun and plush. So I'm going to be using 3M command strips to hang my frame right here on my wall. And this is awesome because it means you don't have to damage your walls at all. You don't have to poke any holes in them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this project. Let me know if you liked it, and I shall see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.